Thank you to Foundation Devices for being a sponsor of this podcast. When it comes to beautiful, air-gapped, open source Bitcoin hardware wallets, this is a fantastic team to check out, Foundation Devices. Because I've come to realize it's not just about the hardware. The hardware can look great. It can be open source, it can be secure, but you also have to know the ethos of the team behind it, because they're the ones who are going to offer you firmware upgrades. They're the ones who can change the functionality of your device. You can have a hardware wallet that does exactly what you need, but if the team starts to develop in a direction you don't like some would say Trezor and Ledger have started to do over the past year or two, it's not easy to make a change. But the team at Foundation, they'll tell you right to your face, they're focused on more than just your Bitcoin. They're focused on your sovereignty and your freedom. And that's why I support them, and I appreciate them supporting me with this podcast. You can check out Foundation and their Passport Bitcoin wallet at foundationdevices.com. This week I'm joined by the one and only Bruce Fenton. He's an OG Bitcoiner, we'll say. He's been involved with Bitcoin for 11 years. He's the host of the very prestigious Satoshi Roundtable annual gathering. Bruce also ran in the Republican primary for the U.S. Senate last year in New Hampshire, which we're going to talk a lot about. He's been in the business of securities for 30 years. He's CEO of Chainstone Labs. He's the owner of Watchdog Capital, which is an SEC registered broker. He does it all. This guy does it all. He's jack of all trades. Let's jump right into it with Bruce Fenton. Yeah, Bruce, thanks for jumping on with me.
Thanks for having me.
I've been wanting to talk to you for so long. I mean, we've caught up before, but, lately you've been talking about Vivek Ramaswamy a lot, which I want to get to.
For sure.
But first, the stuff I really wanted to ask you about was running for Senate, man. Because it's I'm so curious about how that changed your perspective on things, with politics and just with the country. And has life gotten back to normal, or is it permanently changed for you?
Well, a little of both. I was lucky in that I had a good job to fall back on and was able to go right back to my normal life. A lot of candidates, don't, they quit their job so they can run or something like that, or they don't have that option. So I was lucky to be able to go back into my normal routine. But yeah, it did change me. I certainly think differently. I think about politics a lot. The fellow who was my campaign manager works for my company now. So, we both got kind of a PhD in politics. Neither of us had been in politics before. And, we care about New Hampshire because we have a lot of friends, and we made even more friends on the campaign trail. A lot of the other people who were running for office, other candidates for federal office, my opponents, this kind of thing. We got to know all of the officials in the Republican Party and the governor and everything. So, and we learned a lot. I learned a lot about politics. I learned a lot about, what it takes to run. One of the reasons that I ran originally was just to kind of level up my skills. I think biting off more than you can chew, doing something interesting like this, it's definitely, when I ran, I knew I was a long shot. I came in late. My opinions are not always mainstream. So there was a lot of factors where I knew it was kind of a long shot, but I said, well, you know what, if I run and lose, I will learn something. I'll be well positioned if I want to run again, and I'll level up my skills. I gave a couple hundred speeches. I got a lot better about kind of dealing with people and crowds and that kind of thing. Thinking on my feet, interviews, this kind of stuff. So I thought it was a great experience. I learned a lot about politics, learned a little bit about myself, and got to tour this great state of New Hampshire. So I'm glad I did it.
So it didn't jade you? It didn't make you more skeptical of how the country's run or anything like that, or what? A
little bit, sure, in some ways. One of the things, probably the biggest disappointment was the realization that all the experts, because I don't like listening to experts. I shouldn't say that. It depends on the expert. I really like to see evidence, and I don't tend to trust anything unless I experience it or unless I really, really trust the speaker. And a lot of people said, well, hey, look, Bruce, your ideas don't matter. All that matters is money. And I was a little naive on that. I said, no, come on. come on, I can reach the voters. People care. Like the whole country's a mess right now. Certainly people are going to care about ideas. But unfortunately, this is very much Coke versus Pepsi. And if I came to you as an investor and I said, Chris, I got a new soda. It tastes even better than Coke or Pepsi. It's delicious, caramel colored carbonated beverage, a sweet beverage. And we're going to beat Coke and Pepsi because it tastes better. As a wise investor, you'd think that was crazy. You'd say, doesn't matter if it tastes better. It doesn't matter if it tastes better. You're not going to beat Coke and Pepsi. Nobody's sitting there saying Coca-Cola is where it is because it's absolutely the best soda in the whole world. There's probably some grandmother somewhere who makes homemade soda that's better than, or some little roadside stand that makes homemade sodas that are better. But it's all marketing, and the marketing companies know that down to the penny, what it costs them to market you to become a Coca-Cola customer. And the political parties, which are also very much like Coke versus Pepsi, also in the fact that they're not that different, they know exactly down to the penny what it costs to get a vote. And it is marketing, and it's a very well-tuned, they try and appear folksy, but it's a well-tuned, well-oiled, multi-deca-billion-dollar machine. And they have the marketing down to an absolute science. They know exactly who the voters are, how to turn them out, and many other factors. So it really does just come down to the money, unfortunately. And you can have great ideas and be a great speaker and everything else, but rarely will it break away from just spending, and almost nothing is enough to overcome the kind of spending that people spend in these races. My opponent. So I ran for the Republican primary. The person who beat me in that primary, General Don Bolduc, he's a friend of mine. We're kind of all friendly, the Republicans, to the extent the opponents can be. But he was a good guy. One of the things that I respect most about him is he has an incredible work ethic. He's a former general. I don't think he's slept in, for a single day in the last 50 years. He's the kind of guy who's up at 4 or 5, and he would work these crazy schedules. He worked all day, every day during the campaign. And he made 350 appearances in New Hampshire. He went to every town almost twice. He did appearance after appearance, 3 appearances a day. He met everybody. The incumbent that he ran against, Maggie Hassan, who has a 98% similar record to Elizabeth Warren, she did something like 2 appearances. She wasn't even here in the state, and it just didn't matter. She didn't need to play this game. What do you need to wake up at 6 a.m. and go up 2 hours away to go speak to a Republican town committee? Why do that when you can just have George Soros shower the state with television ads? And that's exactly what happens in these races, unfortunately. So I'd like to, see that broken away from, but, lesson learned. I was naive, but that only happens once. If I ever run again, unfortunately, I'm going to just shake every single person down that I know. I didn't really raise money. In fact, I joked at the Bitcoin Miami. I said, don't send me money. Stack sats. You'll do better for yourself if you do. But if I ran again, I would run to win, and I would be very serious about raising money, because it's no purpose in, just running again and not having a plan to win,
Yeah, but can you raise the kind of money you have to raise if you don't have the backing of the people with the money? I mean, it's like, well, see, catch 22, right?
Trick.
Yeah,
that's the trick, because it's a very establishment thing. I mean, I know more billionaires and more rich people than, I don't know, 0.001% of, my whole career I've been involved in money. I met many, many, many billionaires. I worked in the Middle East for huge PE firms. My job was basically rubbing elbows with sheikhs and royals. And then I got into Bitcoin, and a whole mess of my friends became extraordinarily wealthy, and I've advised people and worked with people. So I've been around people with money more than almost anybody you can think of. So you would think it would be really easy for me to just make a few phone calls and raise the kind of money you need. That's not the case. For one thing, you need is an extraordinary amount of money. I could call up my rich friends and raise a couple bucks, but raising 20, 30, 40, 50 million dollars is a whole nother story. Really, the only way to get that kind of money is the big donors who put in 5 million at a pop. And there's not a lot, even the wealthiest people, even billionaires, don't just throw 5 million around. It's a very establishment kind of process. And again, it goes back to these power players. Mitch McConnell runs a huge PAC. that if you're aligned with McConnell, they can award you, $5-10 million for your race. But obviously, that's not going to happen to me. I mean, I openly criticize McConnell. So if you luck out and somebody like a Thiel or somebody who's really wealthy and who is very generous with the donating, that could work. But it's a pretty hard game. Even with wealthy friends, it's I might be able to raise a couple million, but that's not enough to win these big federal races, unfortunately.
It's like what drew us to Bitcoin. I'm sure I can speak for you to some regard, when it comes to this. What drew most of us was the fact that we're going to sort of create this flat structure where we don't have this power structure, where we don't have kingmakers, where we don't have people that can change the rules if they have enough money, which is basically like a proof of stake system, right? But then you compare that to what you're talking about with the way that politics works, and I start to wonder, like, is there, first of all, do you think that, I mean, you can't possibly think this is a good way to do it, right? Politically, like whoever has the most money crowns the kings, right? Like, that's not good.
Right. It's a terrible system. And it's sad, now a lot of people say they recognize the problem and they say, oh, well, what we need is more campaign finance reform. We need more rules and we got to, overturn Citizens United, which actually means, changing the First Amendment. Or we need to do this or that, or we need to ban this group from donating or ban billionaires or something like that. I'm skeptical of any of those efforts because the rules are written by the people who are benefiting from this system. So we passed a bunch of campaign finance. Does anybody think McCain and Feingold, when they passed McCain-Feingold, were really just great Americans looking out for the truth? I mean, maybe they thought that at best, but they were partisan hacks and they were part of the problem. So we had campaign finance and it just created PACs and everything. And by the way, there's a whole mess of rules, but that's a very insider club. It's extremely difficult to figure out what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do. It's very clear to the people, like Elizabeth Warren or Maggie Hassan, who are in this system. They have whole armies of consultants and people. There's a whole cottage industry, a multi-billion-dollar industry, all these PACs and everything. And they have rules like the campaign can't coordinate with the PAC. And that's all nonsense. They have their ways of coordinating. They've gamed this system so that, the law originally said, oh, you can't coordinate. So everybody knows that now. So they have all these wink, wink, nod, nods like, well, I understand you're coming to my event, wink, and you're not here on behalf of your PAC, but, and I know we can't share photos from our event. However, if you go to brucefenton.com/open source, you'll see some open source photos that you're allowed to use that you might want to use on your PAC brochure if you want to. Right. This is the kind of thing that and then I didn't know how to do any of these games. I didn't have a PAC. I didn't know how to do it. It all seemed like nonsense. I didn't have interest in it, and I found it opaque and frustrating. But the political system, people like Elizabeth Warren have absolutely mastered it. Everybody in her staff knows all the rules about who can talk to who and how you can do it, and all these people donating, they know where to donate it, and they do bundling. You're able to get a big mailing list and they collect checks and then they send the checks, and there's it's just a big system. And what it does, it makes it harder for somebody like me as an outsider. I came into this and all I knew is that, you can go to jail for campaign finance stuff. That's the main thing. So I look at this and I see, very difficult. I'm used to reading securities regulations. Some of these finance regulations are even more difficult. Very difficult to figure, how do we accept Bitcoin? How can we do this? Who do I have to make sure I get AML from? Because you can't just take money. I can't just put up a Bitcoin address and say donate to Bruce. I have to know who that's coming from, make sure it's not foreign. You have to be able to return things. People can donate, double for your primary and your race, but you got to return it if you don't win the primary. There's all these goofy regulations, and it made it quite difficult. And I was really afraid. I said, all right, I'm just going to be extra conservative. I'll spend my own money. I'm not going to worry too much about raising, because the more you raise, the more careful you have to be. And then you have to say, well, okay, I raised money and then I took my credit card from the campaign and I bought a bunch of staffers food. Well, did I bring my own food? What if I bought my kids food? Does that, am I going to get in trouble for? So when in doubt, I just paid myself so I would avoid
Right.
trouble. But that's not a good system because it's very hard and opaque. So the solution, I don't think, is more regulation or more efforts at campaign finance reform, because the snakes on the swamp will just figure out a way around that. The solution is actually make government so small that it doesn't have anything anybody wants. So nobody bothers to hire a lobbyist because there's nothing the lobbyist can get. That's the way to do
Right.
it.
Yeah.
Is really
But how do you do that without doing the first thing? Right? It's like, it's insane.
Exactly.
It's almost like it's such a unique position to be in, to understand how Bitcoin works and understand how that level of decentralization can be achieved. And then live in that world financially, and then live in this corrupt political world that is the exact opposite. It's basically this totally corrupted crony proof of work system that's totally opaque in a lot of regards. And it makes you wonder, because most people, 99% of people still, even if they have Bitcoin, they don't really appreciate why it's valuable, I think. But I feel like if we could ever get to the point where we could apply those principles to politics, I feel like we'd be going somewhere, as opposed to just sitting in this corrupt morass of nonsense. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. One point on that is like, you notice in Bitcoin, people talk about ideas, and especially the best conferences, the more technical ones, like I'm not super technical, but I enjoy things like, Baltic Honey Badger, and, where you go and it's Adam Back and 300 super nerds, rather than nothing against, it's fun to go to the 10,000, 20,000 person conferences with Lambos too, but there's more meat and substance in these smaller technical conferences. Everybody's talking about ideas. They're talking about Schnorr and privacy and BIP 300 and how you're going to do different tokens and smart contracts on Bitcoin. And very little talk about people. You go to a political event, the old saying, what is it? Small minds talk about people, big minds talk about ideas. You go to a political event, everything's all like, oh, this person's chief of staff is this and this and this. And I've been in circles where I've hung out with the Davos World Economic Forum crowd, the World Bank, and the epitome of all of it. If you watch Chernobyl on HBO, there's these amazing scenes in the first, all through the season. I've only watched the first episode, but the way that the Soviets worked, where it's like, oh, the director general of the executive committee is going to talk to the other executive committee, who's going to talk to the deputy chief of nuclear regulatory affairs, and everybody's just terrified, like, oh boy. And I've been in those same kind of rooms, not in Soviet Russia about nuclear, but about banking and finance. When I did some charity work and things like that in the Middle East, it's really hilarious how these people talk. They're like, oh my goodness, the so-and-so, deputy undersecretary of the executive committee for the Department of Finance is coming. And everybody's obsessed with people, and they're just spinning their wheels on nonsense. And that's kind of what politics is. Politics at its worst is epitomized by what we saw with Chernobyl and Soviet Russian, and maybe the complete opposite of that. Politics at its best is sort of lack of politics, where nobody talks about any of this stuff and it doesn't really matter. You're talking about the ideas instead. So I think the world could learn a lot from Bitcoin.
Yeah. And it's always been that way. That's the thing. Like, since the beginning of recorded history, like, people have been ruled by personalities, basically. It's like the personality plus the power, and then you get this mutated. That's why every president in the US is different, right? It's like you have the power, and then it's the personality that's like this variable, like, and then you get this mutation, right? And it's always a different mutation, and that's why every regime is a little bit different, and it's inconsistent, and you never know what you're going to get until it's too late, and it's so imperfect, and it just makes you wonder, with this technology and this new way of thinking that we like are privileged to have from Bitcoin, and it's still so early, like, it's like most people don't get it. But is there a future where that can have some impact? And I'm not even saying like I'm definitely not saying like blockchain government or anything like that. I'm just talking about the principles of it. Like You know what I mean? Like, it's like, and I also feel like they tried, like, I feel like the Constitution was an attempt at this based on the tech they had available back then. But it's like, I feel like we're revving up. I hope it happens in my lifetime, but I doubt it. But I feel like we're revving up towards this new way of approaching a constitution that could be more programmatic and more predictable and take the personalities out of it. What do you think? Is that a hope that you think is realistic?
Yeah, I hope so. And we have to rest that hope in Gen Z. They're a generation. The healthiest thing about Gen Z is that they're very skeptical of centralized power. And because we're in kind of this fourth turning, a time of epic change, we're seeing old power structures of, CNN and the New York Times being replaced by Joe Rogan, and the World Economic Forum and the IMF being replaced by Bitcoin. And so we see this, but there is still something about this old style, and maybe it's in human nature, our tribal nature as humans, that there's always going to be people who look to a leader. There's something to be said for a leader. And it's interesting in my case because I started my career in the 90s, and I was kind of like your classic 90s business person. I wore a suit and I listened to books about self-help, and I went to Tony Robbins seminars on how to become a great speaker. And a lot of that kind of style is kind of campy now. Mike Pence, I met him on the campaign trail. He's the absolute master of that. I could tell you stories about Mike Pence when he met us. Well, real quickly, he met me, and then 3 days later, he recognized me out of a crowd, and he said a nice thing to my kid specific to me. He said, "Oh, I hope you're enjoying your train set." He just barely, one little tiny line he had heard 3 days earlier out of 300 people. And I'm like, wow, no wonder the guy, I don't agree with his politics. I'm not a Mike Pence fan, but I'm like, wow, this guy has absolutely mastered the art of the 90s style politics. But look at him in the polls now. That kind of style is gone, and I think especially Gen Z, who is barely voting now, but Gen Z, they're not impressed by that. They're not going to look at, they're not going to look like their grandparents and their boomer parents and say, wow, that guy has a blue suit with a red tie and he's clean shaven. He must be trustworthy. That's an old ideology from a different time, and hopefully they're going to move more towards the cypherpunk way. If anything, one weakness of my campaign was because the average voter in New Hampshire is 79 years old for the primary, I was probably too cypherpunk. I had an unbuttoned shirt and a t-shirt, and I was kind of casual. And originally, when I first started, if you look at my race in the first few months, I was like very anti-establishment. I was just like resistant to anything. I had like a very non-campaigny website. I didn't do I said, look, I'll meet people, I'll meet voters, and I'll talk to press. That's it. I'm not doing any other games. I'm not doing any other nonsense. And in some ways it was refreshing, and I was glad with how I ran the campaign. But in other ways it was maybe too cypherpunk for a mass market audience, because there is a lot of people who are from even still from that kind of 90s mold. So I think the balance will be interesting as we go forward, and hopefully we move towards your vision of a more kind of cypherpunk democracy, to find the right balance of, where do figureheads fit in there? And can we have, because I feel like we do need leaders in some way. And if not, if we all are just cypherpunks, and I think you and I are similar in some respects of kind of like our mannerisms and our way of interacting and everything, you or I could easily have launched some coin and become a figurehead and become some variation of a Richard Hart and made a bunch of money and gotten into a lot of trouble and hurt a lot of people. I mean, it's not a hard thing to do. So if everybody is kind of saying like, hey, I'm not playing the game, I'm not going to be talking about people, I'm going to be talking about ideas, well, then a Sam or a Richard Hart can easily come in and co-opt people who haven't internalized that yet. There's a lot of people who are like, wow, he had Tony Blair and Bill Clinton at his event. He must be for real. So they gave Sam billions of dollars. So, and I've thought about this a lot with myself. I resist it. It's interesting. If this was 15 years ago, I probably would have quadruple the following in crypto Twitter. Like if I was a different point in my life, I would have been giving speeches and, walking the walk and talking the talk and doing all the things for eyeballs. But as I got more mature and I moved on in life, those things became less important to me. And at my age now and where I am now, I think of a lot of those things as silly. I'm like, that's just silly. Like putting on a suit and doing a song and dance. That's silly. I want to talk about important stuff like how we can change the world, how we can decentralize. I don't want to be sitting there, doing some silly speech about, America and the children, things that have no substance. So there's some balance in there. I think maybe we need a new kind of leader that if I could figure out how to do it, I would. But I think it's probably going to be somebody in Generation X who kind of comes forward as, and galvanizes people and is somebody you can look to and say, this is somebody I'd follow. But they're also in favor of those ideals of, tearing everything down and putting power with the people. Maybe that's what the founders did.
Yeah. Yeah. So much of what you're talking about just resonates with the experiences I'm having in crypto lately and politics. It's the same thing. And I like to say it boils down to whether or not you're willing to monetize the trust that people are putting into you, and that you're asking them to put into you, whether it's warranted or not. And usually it's not. Like usually if another human that you don't know is asking you to trust them in some regard, whether it's a politician or a CEO or whoever it might be, you usually shouldn't be trusting them because like you said earlier, like you shouldn't trust what you can't examine, what you can't know yourself, but it's like throughout crypto, throughout politics, throughout every aspect of the world. Isn't this capitalism though? Like I keep going back and forth on this. Isn't this like a flaw of capitalism in a way? Because capitalism naturally gravitates towards this, like the carnival barker, that's kind of like selling you stuff, trying to extract maximum value from you. And I it makes me question my own principles once in a while. Like, is unbridled capitalism in this way really the best route? Or are we heading towards a place where people are just going to be putting their trust in whoever can spend the most money to convince them of something?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because you can, you can basically spend your way into trust. And trust can be a good thing. Naval has a neat piece that he did about, investing in long-term people in long-term games, it's called. And, he basically align with people that are going to be around for a while. And that's sort of a form of trust, so trust can be important. There's probably nothing wrong with that. And maybe it's all part of the system, but I do have some moral struggles sometimes to trying to figure out, what the proper, to me, self-promotion and stuff seems so cheesy now. And I was so good at it. And I did a lot of it when I was younger. I used to go around giving financial seminars, and that's what my career was for a big chunk. But I just felt like I moved beyond that. There was one point in, one of the first big bull runs where I had kind of life-changing money, and I'm like, I'm never wearing a suit again. I haven't followed that. I have worn a suit a few times, and now I'm actually thinking suits might be good. Maybe you don't want the look like which is funny because it's right back to trust again. Sam went and had this like, oh, look at me, I'm wearing t-shirts and sloppy shorts when I'm meeting the former world leaders, and then you look at it and say, well, yeah, but look at what a clown he was. Maybe there's something to be said for it.
You're just a boomer.
Yeah. But part of me is like, do you, especially if you want to make change, do you have, like, there is some aspect of that kind of 90s style politician. If I were to run again, I would probably be even less, I don't want to say left cyberpunk in my ideals and my ideas. I'm going to stick with my principles. I'm very, very strong on my principles, but my marketing would probably be more, along the spectrum with me at one end and Pence on the other side. I'd probably play a little bit more of those stupid games, things like parades, for example. All the political concerns. Oh, Bruce, you've got to go to the parade. I'm like, what the heck does a parade have to do with anything? I'm trying to save this country from evil and tyranny. I don't care about the stupid parade. I think parades are silly. They're a waste of time. But that's what every politician has to do. So there's some amount of game playing. And, I think that is some part of humanity. And no matter how successful we are with a cypherpunk decentralized revolution, there still is going to be leaders. And there's also nothing wrong with leaders. If you have good leaders, people that you really, really respect, where you look at somebody and you say, wow, this is a man or a woman that I would like to follow, that can be a good thing. But those are those are rare examples now. It's hard to do that.
Yeah, it's like with the presidential primaries and stuff, like with DeSantis, you see him out there throwing baseballs, and Vivek out there rapping Eminem, and I go back and forth on it. Like, I understand why he needs to be at the state fair. I get it. I understand you have to find places to speak to people directly. But then you look at like Trump, who sort of bucked a lot of that, right? Like if Trump did one thing right, I would say to a certain extent, he bucked the whole, like, I'm a politician, I'm going to go be in a parade, I'm going to be kind of not who I actually am. Because when you're talking about marching in a parade, that's not you, right? But you're talking about doing it just because it's expected from a politician. And it's like, then you got Trump out there who's like, screw all of this. I'm just going to do whatever and call everybody fat and tell them they're idiots and see what happens. Yep. So it's like, what is the winning recipe? It almost seems like people want that real reality thing, except would he have even ever had that if he didn't have all the money and all the fame and everything that came before he became president? So it's like you need this special witch's brew of just serendipity almost to be able to be thrust into that spot, right? And like nobody has that. It's so rare.
Yeah, it is very rare. I mean, you look at people like Chris Christie and Mike Pence, who are lifelong politicians with a lot of money and a lot of power and a lot of recognition. They have honed their skills over a long, long time, and they're getting crushed in this. I mean, this is the presidential primaries, and the election is a very, very big deal. It's the kind of one of the ultimate games with the ultimate stakes. And you can never underestimate how smart any of the candidates are and how smart their teams are and how, how their supporters are going to do and any number of other things. So, people do kind of cry for that authenticity. I think that's one of Vivek's strengths, is coming out and, just being himself. It was one of my strengths in the campaign, but it's hard to do. The more you speak, the more you're going to upset somebody if you have opinions. What they tell you in the old days, they've gotten better, politicians overall, and I think Trump helped move this needle a little bit. But you go back 30 years or more, a lot of politicians wouldn't even tell you their position. They'd ask them, they'd say, what's your position on abortion? They say, well, you're going to have to wait until the vote comes up once I'm in the Senate.
They still do this.
They still do it a little bit, but they get pushed a little bit. There's not a lot of real journalists, so they can get away with it. But it's become a partisan thing. They like to get clicks and media, so people take opinions for a strategic reason. But a lot of them, they will avoid, and they'll take the consultants will tell you, take the minimum, make the minimum statement. Avoid saying anything, because anytime you take a firm stand, you're going to lose half of the people who care about that issue. Yeah. And that's a shame. We should have more people who just speak their mind, and hopefully we're moving more that way with politicians like Vivek.
Yeah, with these primaries, it's like I'm getting old enough now to remember many of them, and I feel like we've been through this so many times where we go through this, regardless of the party, like we go through this phase where we're looking at all the people and we're like, oh, this guy's a real standout. This guy's a real standout. Oh, he's got a real shot. And every single time it boils down to who is sort of who gets the machine behind them, right? Like who gets it almost makes you feel like we don't really have a say in it, anymore, and so this one is really interesting because you got Trump, who seemingly has the machine against him, at least one machine. He's got other machines behind him. And then you're looking at like DeSantis, who clearly has some sort of machine behind him, but it's a much different machine. And the machines are actually getting more mysterious, aren't they? Right? It's like, what is this machine behind DeSantis? What is this, with Vivek too, I mean, look, he's got big pharma ties. I'm sitting here like looking at all this. I'm like, what is exactly? I almost feel like I'm constantly getting hoodwinked, like I'm looking at this primary. That's why I'm starting to be like, what am I really gonna achieve here, by supporting any of these guys. But how did you get like so behind Vivek? Like when did you know him from before he started running?
No, it was an interesting process. I had assumed that I was going to be a DeSantis supporter. Once I ran for office, I'm a libertarian. I've been a libertarian forever, and I hadn't been officially registered with the Republican Party, basically forever. I'd registered as an independent, but when I ran for office, you got to register with the party. So I officially became a Republican, and I, joined the party and ran for office, and I've kept that, I've kept that,
You sold
that
your soul.
registration.
Hey, what's that
What's that?
ringtone, man? What
Oh,
was that?
sorry, that's a call to prayer.
Are you Muslim?
Yes, I am.
I had no idea.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was. I have a little clock on my wall.
Were you raised Muslim?
No, no, I became a few years back, over a long period of time. I lived in that region. I lived in the Middle East. I've been traveling in the Middle East for over 20 years. So, it was a long process of learning and, kind of, just learning over time. A long, slow journey for me. I'm a slow learner, I guess.
So were you Christian? Not to get too
Yes,
personal, but yeah, I'm just curious. I didn't know
I
you were
was
Muslim.
raised. I was raised Christian, but I was not. There was various times in my life when I've been kind of agnostic, and I was more of a Unitarian Christian, which is very similar to Muslims. The main difference between Muslims and Christians or non-Unitarian Christians is the how we look at the Trinity, and so the Unitarian belief is very, very similar to Islam, and then the only other difference is believing that Muhammad was a prophet who delivered the word of God. That's kind of that's the main the main belief in Islam. And so for me that was the main thing. I spent a lot of time saying, well, what is this book? What is this book, and is it the word of God? And there's a lot of special principles and properties of the Quran, like, for example, 4 million people know how to memorize it. What other book is there that over 1 million people, including children, can memorize the entire thing word for word? And I've met many of them. Any mosque you go and say, who knows the Quran by heart, every single word, and there's going to be somebody in there, especially a bigger mosque. There's going to be many people. So there's interesting properties of this book, and I spent a lot of time saying, what is this, and do I believe it, and is it true? And that's kind of what I came up with.
Was this I mean, now that I know that, it had to be a factor in the New Hampshire primary, right? I mean, if you're dealing with 79-year-old New Hampshire people, and they got this Muslim cypherpunk running for Senate.
It's funny. I was all prepared to. I thought it was going to be a big fight. I thought people were going to hate me or something, and most people either didn't know or didn't care.
Okay.
I only had a handful of people ask me during the campaign, and I answered truthfully. But it was never really picked up. But I know the opposition research. I know the Democrats know. I think they avoided mentioning it because, Republican Muslims, their worst nightmare. It invalidates all their stuff about diversity and everything else. So I think they're kind of terrified about it. They look at it like, oh my gosh, this it's like, fire to a caveman or something. Like they don't know what to think. Right. And the Republicans, I mean, what are they going to do? They're not going to attack me over it. That would make them look horrible. So it didn't really become an issue, and I didn't make it an issue. I didn't make a big deal about it, trying to, I don't like talking about religion too much. Like I feel like it's a personal thing, and I don't like making myself oh, look at me, I'm the Muslim candidate, I'm the Muslim guy. I prefer to just kind of have people judge me on my other words and not, skin color, religion, or gender or anything.
Yeah. No, I hear that. It makes sense.
But it is relevant since it came up. I mean, it is relevant in the world now. I think that there's a lot of, it's interesting. There's a lot of people turning to faith. And I like all people of faith, Muslims call Christians people of the book, and Jews, all three religions from the same Abrahamic faith. And, I went to the Kaaba in Mecca, and that a lot of people don't know what the Kaaba is. That's the house of Abraham. It's the same Abraham from the Bible and the Torah. That's the same. It's the same God. It's definitely the same God that all three of the major religions believe in. And Vivek is Hindu, and he mentioned he believes in one God and only one God, which is exactly the same phrase that Muslims use to describe it. So I kind of like people of faith. I think that the Church of Woke, and I call it that because I think it does behave a lot like a church, I think is an ideology. I think it really is very much like a religion, and it is a religion in many ways. And a lot of people who do not have other religion, and I don't have any problem with atheists and agnostics. I was an agnostic for a long time. I called myself an atheist for a while. My brother said agnostic sounds better. It sounds more open-minded because you're questioning rather than you're sure. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of went from atheist to agnostic to sort of very broad believer to, where I am now. But I think that having some kind of faith, and you could even call it Mother Nature if you want, or the Force, from Star Wars, something bigger than yourself. There's something that we don't understand in the world, some bigger force, bigger than ourselves. If you want to call that God or Allah or Mother Nature or fate or karma or whatever, I think there is something bigger than us that we don't understand. And I think there is kind of good versus evil. And more recently in my journey over the last 10 years, I've kind of adopted this idea that there's some sort of intelligent design behind this. I mean, there really is some incredible things. If you look at, we have this moon that moves around our planet, and based on how it moves, it sucks up all the water in one area because of gravity, and we have tides. And because of tides, we have billions and billions and billions of animals that live because of the tides. Right here on my bay where I live, the low tide, the water goes out and the birds can feed on all of the mussels and animals that are in there. And if we didn't have that, those animals wouldn't exist and the birds wouldn't exist. And there's all these incredible things in our world that kind of leads me to think of some sort of intelligent design and thinking about these broad issues of good versus evil. I think there really is evil in the world. And I think that's epitomized by, something like what I call the Church of Woke, this ideology that worships the state and is anti-family, a lot of the traditional values that most people of faith have. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's all relevant to today. And I've noticed a lot of people kind of turning towards faith since the year 2000 or so with the lockdowns and the COVID tyranny or whatever reasons that they had. I think people are looking at this kind of chaotic, crazy world and saying, what did people hundreds of years ago, people dealt with crazy chaos as well. There was a lot of people that turned to faith. I was down at the Jamestown settlement. Where is that? Is that Virginia? Yeah, it must be Virginia. I was there as visiting it, and they have the chapel and the, what they've done. And they have this monument to the pastor there. And in, I think 2 years, like 35 people died out of like 90, like a third of everybody died. So here's this pastor, you think like, okay, here's this little guy in this tiny, tiny, tiny little town, a town of 100 people in the middle of nowhere. And basically every single week, the guy's doing another funeral every week. And I'm like, wow, what did he deal with? And they turned to faith. That's what people did back then. They were Christians. They turned to faith. And you've seen that throughout history. People in times of chaos have turned to faith, and they've been rewarded for it. And I think there's some universal truths in that, especially when you take the three major big religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. There are common things. And I remember when I first started learning that, living in Saudi Arabia, and saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, are all these people wrong? There's got to be some truths in this. There's got to be some kind of truths. If all of these three religions, there's got to be some sort of truths in this. And that's kind of what I focused on.
Yeah. The whole woke thing is basically, to me, it looks like people who replaced God with humans, right? So they think that humans are the the highest level of enlightenment that you can achieve in the universe, and clearly different from the religions you're talking about, where humans acknowledge or believe that there is a more enlightened something out there, right, that guide them or can sort of be looked to as the supreme being. So it's pretty clear to me that you're right, that the woke thing is, I hesitate to call it a religion, but I guess in that regard, it's like the religion of humans, right? As God, and like they think that we are it. Like that's why I get so repelled when people talk about life extension and making people immortal. And I hear Vitalik Buterin talking about like, how can we have humans live till they're 300 years old? And like, I'm just sitting there thinking, okay, wait a minute. Humans aren't all that great. Like, I don't really want them around that long. It's like there's so many things that can go wrong if you have that happen. It's like, how do you have even worse situations where people maintain power and these power structures live for millennia. I go a whole different way. I mean, personally, I think that, that that we're just like a coincidence. I think that's where my mind tends to go, is that like, humans, we think we're really cool and really smart and really everything, but so do ants. Yeah. So do other animals and on other planets, if there are organisms and they can't think the way we can, it's still everything that we know and see is just like within our context, within our realm of what we're able to understand. And we don't know to what level we're able to understand the universe. Right. So I go with that agnostic route too, but I'm pretty cynical when it comes to a lot of religious stuff, and the woke stuff, forget it. I mean, I think they're way off the rails. That's one of the things Vivek has that I really appreciate. Like the messaging on that stuff is right on, like it nails it for me, as far as that stuff he talks about.
Yeah, I think you had asked before my clock went off on why I ended up supporting him. I had assumed I was going to support DeSantis. I like I like any of the Republicans. The Republican Party grew on me. I had been kind of, very much libertarian, and like a lot of other libertarians, I was, slightly Republican leaning, but real loyalty to the Libertarians and no loyalty to the Democrats. And then, but after kind of becoming as a candidate, you have to become an official card-carrying Republican, so to speak, and I wanted to have some loyalty to that. I didn't want to just run and then drop right back out of the party, after the election. So I still get invited to the Republican breakfasts, and I know that, state chair people and, this kind of thing. And they're very helpful to me as a candidate. And so I do feel some loyalty. And also I got to know a lot of the really good Liberty Republicans. 20 years ago, it was like Thomas Massey and that was it. Ron Paul maybe, and but now you have, Warren Davidson and Jim Jordan and Thomas Massey and Rand Paul and Ted Cruz to some extent. There is a solid liberty wing of the very powerful in New Hampshire politics. We dominate the state legislature, and then in that nationally, it went from a couple people to a couple dozen. And then there's a couple, many dozens more that maybe not libertarians like Massey, but they will lean for it on certain issues like guns or whatever. So yeah, the Republican Party kind of grew on me, particularly the idea of being a Liberty Republican, which I think is very distinctly different from, what I might call a McConnell Republican or a McCain Republican. And so I knew I was going to support somebody. I like DeSantis because, as you know, I was a big advocate against the masks in schools. I went and protested 8 times at my school board, got removed by police 5 times.
Right on.
Yeah. And so, DeSantis was very good on the COVID policy. I think he was one of the better governors. And
that's why I moved to Florida.
Yeah, I mean, he's great. And but interestingly, he hasn't had a perfect campaign up here in New Hampshire, just wasn't as accessible and everything. And I was skeptical when I first saw Vivek. When I first saw him, I said, oh, this is just a, rich guy, vanity guy. Maybe he's trying to sell books or whatever. I was sort of skeptical. And then I listened to him a few times. All right, this guy's good. He's got some anti-woke stuff. I like that. That was the first thing that I liked about it. I said, but this guy's brave. He's able to speak. He's a pretty good speaker. And then I saw him more and more. I'm like, wow, he really is quite good. And then I got to meet him. And the nice thing about New Hampshire, it's pretty easy to meet these candidates. So I've met Vivek, 10 times now. But after like the first time I saw him in person and met him and shook his hand, that was it wasn't like instantly that I was like, okay, this is my guy, but I was definitely on the path. I said, wow, he's really special. And then he felt like more of my candidate. And then I'd see him do more and more things. And he's just very impressive. And it's very interesting because he's won over a lot of people. You know, you can't like, I'm not an easy person to get the endorsement from. Not that it matters too much. It's not like I'm going to win somebody an election, but I care a lot. I have solid principles. There's certain things I won't. You know, I'd rather go after endorse somebody who has a 1% chance than somebody who has 70%. And I'm not the kind of person, if somebody says, hey, we'll make you ambassador to Saudi if you endorse me, you know, or whatever, which isn't out of the realm of possibility for some of these major candidates. This is a high stakes game, you know, an endorsement of somebody in New Hampshire who matters. Mm-hmm. But I don't care about that stuff. You know, I care about what's right and wrong. And I got to know Vivek more and really, truly believe that he is an extraordinary person, partly because of running in for office. I see how hard it is to do some of this stuff. He just had this activist who identified herself as pansexual, who came up and asked him a kind of a gotcha question about gay marriage or something. And his answer,
I wanted to play the clip. I want to play it right now because I think it's so good.
Yeah, do it.
I heard it this morning and I was like, this is the best I've heard this guy sound. Like the last thing I saw of him was him rapping Eminem and I was like, cringe, right? But then it's like, I heard this and I was like, oh, this guy nailed it.
He does that a lot. And I'm glad they've captured some of this on video because, you know, I had a couple strengths in my campaign. One of them was exactly that, meeting people face to face, just because I have kind of a quick tongue. I was in sales, debates, tough questions from reporters. That was it. I was kind of like a two-trick pony. Those were my really, really good skills. And there's a lot of the other things I didn't have great skills on. He has those two skills that I have, but way, way, way better. It's extreme. Even my best skill on my best day, I don't think I could have done that. And I don't think... And I think I'm really good at it, actually. I don't think. And
let me play it so that people can hear it because it's really good.
I was just wondering, what were your opinions on the LGBTQ plus?
Well, I don't think it's one community.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, how could it be? Just mash together an alphabet soup. Trans is fundamentally in tension with gay, if you ask me. But what's your opinion?
I'm personally pansexual, so I was just wondering what your views on same-sex couples were.
I don't have a negative view of same-sex couples, but I do have a negative view of a tyranny of the minority. So I think that in the name of protecting against a tyranny of the majority, and there are times in this country's history where we have had a tyranny of the majority, we have now, in the name of protecting against tyranny of the majority, created a new tyranny of the minority. And I think that that's wrong. I don't think that somebody who's religious should be forced to officiate a wedding that they disagree with. I don't think somebody who is a woman who's worked really hard for her achievements should be forced to compete against a biological man in a swim competition. I don't think that somebody who's a woman that respects her bodily autonomy and dignity should be forced to change clothes in a locker room with a man. That's not freedom, that's oppression. And so I believe that we live in a country where free adults should be free to dress how they want, behave how they want, and that's fine. But you don't become oppressive by foisting that on others. And that especially includes kids, because kids aren't the same as adults. And so I think adults are free to make whatever choices they want, but do not foist that ideology onto children before children are in a position as adults to make decisions for themselves. And so I think a lot of the frustration in the country, and if I'm being really honest, that I also share, comes from that new culture of oppression where saying those things can actually get somebody punished. And in my case, it's part of why it's my responsibility to say them. And I respect that you may have a different opinion. And that's okay. Part of what makes our country great is that you and I can be civil and have this conversation, and that we live in a country that still gives us, each of us, the right to speak to a presidential candidate and back, and still say that we pledge allegiance to the same nation. So I think that's the beauty of our country, and that's my honest opinion.
Awesome. Well,
Thanks.
Thank you
So
very
good.
much. I appreciate that.
Thank you for your civility as well.
And he gets the
it.
handshake, which is key from this
Amazing.
pansexual questioner. I mean, you know what? It's like you hear pansexual and you're like, oh, she's just a troll. But maybe not. You know, it's like people are actually out there that have sincere, not everybody who's LGBTQIA plus 2S whatever is a troll. Like they're actually trying to live a life that's productive in America, and they want these kinds of answers from people.
Yeah. And that what he did there is a master's class in answering. He was calm, he was effective. He didn't take a wishy-washy stance. He took real and actually quite controversial opinions, but he delivered them in a way that was not offensive even to the opposition, a respectful way. He talked about the problems, but he also differentiated between adults and children. And he talked about liberty. He said something that I say many times, which is, I don't have a problem with adults. There's a narrative that people say, oh, we want trans people to not exist, or we want them to die, or something like that. Or we don't even want them allowed to do what they want to do. I don't think that's a libertarian position at all. As a libertarian, I want everybody, I would actually defend someone's rights to dress in a dress if they want to, or identify themselves however they want. Or if you had an adult business, if you had a bar, let's say, suppose you have a trans only bar, I would absolutely support that business's right to exist. You can't go to I don't think you have the right to go to a trans only bar and say, hey, you must allow non-trans people in. Let them do whatever they want. But he made a key distinction between kids and adults. And his answer was just absolutely on point. And you can't, and this is what I mean about seeing him in person. I've seen him do that many, many times. I'm glad this one was caught on tape. I've seen him in person. He has an intelligence level that you can't fake. You cannot do what he just did there by rehearsing it. Maybe a really, really slick, skilled, one of these 90s styles politicians that I mentioned could rehearse that answer and almost deliver it as well, a Gavin Newsom type. But they can't just come up with it like he can. And he isn't faking. He really is leagues and leagues above the other people in the race, intelligence-wise and ability-wise. He's actually gifted. And I look at the guy sometimes when I'm in the audience. I've gone to a lot of his events, and I say, this is somebody I would follow. This 38-year-old guy is somebody that I would follow. This is somebody I want as my president. This is somebody who can do amazing things. He is smart. He reminds me of the smartest of smart people in our space, and both in terms of intelligence, but also mannerism. He reminds me of somebody I sit down with at the Satoshi Roundtable, who has $500 million and did real successful things in our industry. And that's kind of what he is, basically. He's a self-made, very successful, technical, savvy, smart guy. He was number 25 student in America. He went to, Harvard and Yale. He is actually intelligent, and he's got a wit, and his ability to speak and communicate is right up there with, Ronald Reagan or Obama or Clinton or Milton Friedman, in my opinion.
Where does he stand on the whole bodily autonomy, medical tyranny stuff? Has he been public about that?
Yeah, I mean, he's answered pretty much every kind of question. He got he was in the pharma business, but he was sort of anti-big pharma. One of his big issues was trying to get faster approvals on drugs and working around the FDA system. He
sounds like Trump with the vaccine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Operation Warp Speed.
You're right.
I would say he's like 70% libertarian. He's not, or 80 maybe. He's certainly libertarian leaning. He's probably one of the most libertarian of mainstream candidates. We just haven't had, he's probably very similar to Rand Paul, actually. Rand Paul is not the same as Ron Paul. I'm a fan of all of them. But he's not like the 100% everything libertarian. He comes from more of a, constitutional conservative kind of school as well, which is great. The Constitution was a very good document. And he also has a lot of things driven by his legal knowledge. He went to law school, and he is a student of the Constitution who really cares about this. And he's done something that nobody's done in decades, which is actually think what powers the president has and how can you push this limit and how can you do these things under the rules. So I think overall he wants to not have a big, heavy, he certainly wants to cut government by over 75%, cut all the agencies, shutter some of the agencies, including the FDA and the FBI, and severely reform things like the SEC. And I think that would be a huge start. And, that works to, get these people out of our lives and our bedrooms and our wallets and against this kind of, mandated, tyranny of the, telling people to wear masks and take experimental injections and this kind of thing.
Yeah. I saw he made billions in big pharma, and it was just right away. I didn't dive in to learn everything, but to me it was like flashing red light, like, oh, something's going on here. But it makes me feel bad. I need to do more research on that.
He's talked a lot about he was more like Little Pharma who became big. He wasn't like Pfizer guy. You know, he had his own startup basically that ended up doing extraordinarily well, kind of bucking the system. So you know, sometimes, you know me well enough to know how funny this is, but sometimes people will see that I'm SEC registered. They'll be like, oh, look at this guy. He's SEC registered. What could he possibly know?
Yeah.
You know, they assume I'm some sort of status just because of the thing. Somebody said on my bio, it said, you know, has operated broker dealers for 30 years. And they say, oh, how could that be a positive? It's like, well, you got to judge each person individually. He was under the system of the FDA, but he was very much at odds with these, you know, he was no friend of Pfizer. You know, he was an opponent of these guys, and he disliked the heavy-handed bureaucracy, very similar to our SEC. I was in a call with him and some industry people not long ago. And you know, he's talked a lot about the similarities between the SEC and the FDA. You have opaque rules that only for SEC, it's BlackRock and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. For the FDA, it's, you know, Pfizer and, you know, the other big players. You know, it's a crony system with opaque rules, very hard for somebody to compete, very unfair, not doing its job in protecting Americans, and it's rewarding cronies. So you see that a lot in these agencies, and I think he'd be the right person to cut it. And he has a real plan. You know, he's actually talked about his plan to actually cut this stuff.
Okay, but here's the real question. Does he have a chance? I mean, you got this guy, pretty unknown, 30-something, Hindu, which is not a non-factor, right? As sad as it is, like, people do care. He has these fringe views, which are still fringe, even though you and I share them. He's just non-conventional. Does he have a chance? Like, if he doesn't have a chance, what is he really doing, and why support him?
He does have a chance. It is an unusual election. There's a lot of unusual factors. The Trump factor is very unusual. There's some chance. Well, for one thing, if suppose you're a Republican, to have a plan B for Trump makes sense. You know, Trump is in his 70s. He's got significant legal problems. He may be barred from running. There could be other things that prevent him from even being able to take office. The weight of all these different cases and, you know, any number of different factors. And I hope that doesn't happen. I think if that was to happen, then we need him more than ever, because it'll be one of our only hopes to you know, save the republic from, you know, we would be on the verge of civil war. If they put Trump in a prison cell or say that he legally can't run, I think we'll have to have somebody like Vivek, because he's, you know, we would need, it'd be the only way you could unify. You know, the only way to, like, placate the Trump fans would be to have somebody who has a lot of similarity to Trump, who hasn't criticized Trump, who has been a supporter of Trump as he has. And it's not just about placating people. It's just about what's right and wrong. It's extremely wrong for America to have this kind of political targeting of the main, you know, front runner. So that is a real factor. The other thing is, although Trump is way, way, way ahead in the polls, that doesn't mean it's going to translate into the, in the ballot for the primary. You know, you have to win New Hampshire and Iowa. Especially if you're Trump. You know, if you're Trump and somehow you get an upset, then all of a sudden, you know, the gig's up. Historically, in a lot of these primaries, the person who was the absolute presumptive nominee and front runner at this stage before the first primary, you know, way before the first primary, those people end up losing a lot. You know, you had you know, Mario Cuomo and John Edwards and Gary Hart, and you know, the history is littered with Republicans and Democrats.
Even Ron Paul was a front runner.
Jeb Bush, perfect example. You know, like he had it made. And what happens is, you don't want to underestimate the significance of these people like DeSantis and attacking Trump. Trump has not been attacked much by his own people. It's easy, you know, his supporters are going to support him. If he gets attacked by the wokes, big deal. They don't care. But when you have somebody credible who's sort of one of their own, who's saying, hey, wait a minute, you didn't do you didn't drain the swamp. You kept Fauci. You didn't fire Fauci. You did Operation Warp Speed. These kind of things. Those are harder. And Trump has made some blunders. Like so far, I don't think he's ever properly addressed the Fauci thing. He said, oh, they're going to complain if I do and complain if I don't. And he just sort of changed the subject. I don't think that's sufficient enough to win the presidency. You do need to earn everyone's votes. Votes are fickle. Even people who like him, who are waving a Trump flag, he could be one bad answer from losing that person as a supporter. And meanwhile, you have somebody like Vivek where he's gaining momentum. This is a great place to be at this point in the race. As he gains momentum, if he can make a strong showing at these debates, which is coming up in a couple weeks, and then it really comes down to New Hampshire and Iowa. If he can, he could do second place even in New Hampshire, would be a huge victory. And then people start saying, oh, which one do you like better, this one or this one? It becomes kind of a two-man race, and that would bode well for him. And then also if he does that, then people say, okay, I like both these guys. Who has the better chance of beating Joe Biden or beating whoever the Democrat nominee is? I think everybody, even Trump's biggest fans, and one of the reasons that I'm not, I'll support Trump if he gets the nomination, but one reason I'm not like a diehard cheerleader for Trump is just, he's just so polarizing. I don't want to go through another 4 years of Orange Man bad, everybody complaining about, and then he said this, and just twisting his quotes all out. He said to inject bleach. He said neo-Nazis are fine people, both of which are fake. He didn't say either of those things, and they'll just spend 4 years, digging out I remember the last 4 years, it was just never ending nonsense. Every day was feigned, being horrified at he said this, he said schools shouldn't have books, or some crazy thing that he didn't even say.
It gives him too much ammo, right? It gives them too much to fight back with. He's so hated that people can't think straight. Personally, as an American, I'd like our country to move on, and I think Vivek is the best one to do that. And also, I want to win. The last thing I want, I'll take any of them over Biden or Gavin Newsom or Kamala or whatever clown they put in there. I mean, anybody's better than them. So I want the person who's going to win and have the best chance of winning. If Vivek can show through his extraordinary campaigning skill, and he really is formidable. He's running an incredible campaign, and you see his personal ability to speak and connect is like no one else. If he can show that he's a real contender, that can change the narrative. And then the Trump fans, even some of the Trump fans, can say, yes, this is a guy who can win the nomination, and he can win the presidency. Yeah. Because he'd clean up. I mean, imagine Biden answering that clip that you just played. Biden could never ever do that. He's not capable of doing it. Even on his best what would he say? It would start with, "Come on, man. Come on, man.
Come on, man.
Give me a break. Look at my record.
Palestinian, and I like ice cream."
That's a stupid question.
Yeah. I mean, even he used to be quick of wit if you look at him in the 80s, but he was a real little Yeah. I mean, he was, I have a little bit of one of the things I respect about Vivek versus my campaign style, I have a little bit of an edge. I'm a little bit more like a Ted Cruz or Marjorie Taylor Greene. I can understand if people don't love me all the time. I'm not always warm and cuddly. Mm-hmm. Vivek is much more likable. Biden, on the other hand, he's worse than any of. He's in his day. You look back to him. Look at the famous clip where the guy said something about his education, and Biden really arrogantly rattled off all this stuff that turned out to all be nonsense. Like, who do you think you're talking to? I was #1 in my law school, a Rhodes Scholar, and I went to Cambridge, and I was 4th in my class at Cambridge. All nonsense. He completely just made up the stuff. He was a politician from an era before cameras, where you could get away with just saying complete and total nonsense and not get called on it. And then cameras came along, and this was early. Biden wasn't used to it. This was like, I think in the late 80s or something, when he was running for office before. He just spewed all this nonsense, but he was a real jerk, even his best days. Vivek is not a jerk at all. I could see that, the kind of Ted Cruz politician style that I have, can be polarizing and ruffling, but Vivek has that kind of Milton Friedman-esque quality of being able to say controversial things in a very calm and disarming way. It's hard to hate Vivek, and that's not insignificant. I don't really want a president that
But you
a
look
third or
back,
half the country hates.
you look look who's been winning lately though, jerks. Like,
Right.
I mean, Trump, Biden. I mean, Obama wasn't a jerk, I guess. He was more in that category of well-spoken and calm,
Good
but it's
communicator for
at
sure.
some point things change. That's what makes me wonder, like, does a nice guy really have a shot at this point? I mean, DeSantis is more of, I'd say he's more of a jerk, right? I mean, he's kind of borderline, like he kind of, but he definitely comes off like he's not, like, I wouldn't particularly want to hang around with him a lot. I think he'd be a good leader, but it's like, I mean, he doesn't seem like he'd be like the most fun guy. Like, so then that's why I see Vivek out there doing Eminem, and I'm like, well, is this really a winning strategy anymore these days? Do people really want this? And
well, he's both. He's really likable, but he also has substance. So he has like a hard edge. Reminds me a lot of, we were talking about religion. A lot of religious people that I know, they are very soft spoken and kind and calm. It's kind of goes with the territory. I mean, you'd be an unusual religious leader if you're out there dropping the F-bomb and calling everybody a-holes. So a lot of them are very calm, but a lot of them have an inner strength. And I feel like Vivek has that. He's very calm and nice, but he's not a pushover. He's not a guy who's just, I mean, even with me, as controversial as I am, there's certain things where I'll just kind of, I get these questions during the campaign, and I would just kind of diffuse it or change the subject. He doesn't do that. He doesn't back down. He'll say a very controversial thing unapologetically right to someone's face. So I think it's a unique combo. I think you want to separate the charisma and the speaking skills, which he has, which are just like Obama and Clinton, who are both, not good people. But they had good skills. So hopefully you get somebody who has good skills, who's also a good person, who also has a strong liberty streak and a strong constitutional streak, and his ideas are good. Because Obama, great speaker, bad ideas, and really bad implementation, and bad, he wasn't grounded, and his overall philosophy was broken. But he was a great speaker. So
I
hopefully
think
we get somebody who's a good speaker who's also a good person.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the most important thing for me, because I would love to see somebody with his principles win. I would love it. I would just, it would be great to have President Vivek. But I'm so jaded after all these decades on this planet observing this nonsense system that we have. Right now, I believe that if he won the nomination, he wouldn't have a chance to win the election. And so what I would love, Vivek, if you're listening to this, I would love it if you could convince people like me that you actually have a shot against, whether it's a Biden or a Newsom or whoever the hell Surface is. I don't think it'll be Kamala, but whatever. Because the left is so, they don't care. They defend Joe Biden, even though he lies, he's old, he's senile. Like, they don't care. They're not defending the person. They're defending, they feel like they're on the defense against the right. Right. So it's like they'll vote for anybody that's in that spot. It could be Donald freaking Duck, and they're going to vote for Donald Duck. So it's like, how can a Vivek, who's a young, unknown Hindu guy, possibly overcome that with like the middle of the road, women of America who basically decide these elections? Like, that's what I would love to. If I could get there, then I could totally full on support him. Right now, I think DeSantis has a way better shot of winning like a general election than Vivek. But
you think? I think he's got more broad appeal. He's got the appeal with the youth. He's harder to attack, which diffuses a lot of the Democrat energy. He talks about I think he can win over. It's interesting, the moms and the women do decide elections to a good degree, and the old men too. Those are your big voters, women and old men. But I think he can reach. He can get kind of the Trump people, but I think he can. Independents are where it's ultimately decided, and I think the way he's the right person at the right time in talking about some of these culture war, trans issues, and things like that. Because the way that he answered that woman in the clip that you mentioned, you'll notice he talked about a couple things from a compassionate standpoint. Like, hey, what about a woman who's worked hard, who doesn't want to compete against a man in her sport? That is a way that you can win over. Now, that person was a specific activist far away from Vivek. I don't know if he won that woman over, but he certainly diffused her. And I think that she's not representative of the average voter either. She's probably a far left voter. But the regular independents who thought that they were jumping into this trans thing because they're trying to help human rights or help women or whatever, I think he can address that in a very calm way and be like, no, actually, that's not the case. And by the way, you're wrong on Ukraine as well. And you're wrong on this and this and this. And I think he can communicate in a way that people respect. And maybe even if they don't agree, they can say, okay, this is somebody that I can respect as a person and I sort of trust them. And, it's a way for our country to move forward. I mean, if he were to run against Biden, I mean, can you imagine? Biden wouldn't even be able to do a debate. It would be such a contrast to see this young, energetic guy who can think on his feet, who's a brilliant genius, versus this old doddering guy whose best days are 40 years ago. And even in his best days was never 1/10 the guy that Vivek is. He's never been as smart, never been as quick, never been as likable. And I don't think they're going to let Biden run, which is just we should prepare ourselves now, for yet another gaslighting. They're going to throw somebody else in last minute, and the Democrats are going to act like this person was there all the time. And they're going to totally forgive and forget that the party has gaslighted them for 4 years, pretending that this doddering fool is coherent or capable. And we all know he's not. We all know he's incompetent, and they know it too. But they're going along with the lie, and they're going to pretend like, oh yeah, sure, he was a wonderful president, but whatever, for health reasons, or if he dies or whatever. Oh, now we've got this other guy, Newsom. But Newsom is kind of like, he's a times are changing. There will be a millennial president and eventually a Gen Z president. Vivek is the first one of this profile to run as a millennial, first millennial to run, but he's not going to be the last. 100% certain a millennial will win, because the 80-year-olds, the McConnells and the Pelosi's, they just statistically cannot be around much longer, 5 or 10 years max. Or maybe 1 year, maybe now is the time to switch, but it will switch and the young people will vote more. And I'm optimistic. America's had a lot of problems in history, 1968, 1932, various years where we almost elected communists. We had total civil rights collapse and a war and assassination of prominent people in 68. And we came out of it. And I'm hoping that the pendulum swings the other way and we can come out of this mess on the other side. And this would be the perfect person to do that. So anything can happen in these kind of crazy times of chaos, a fourth turning. So he certainly could do it. And I'm cautiously optimistic.
Would love to see it, man. This is why we have to be anti-life extension too, because who wants Nancy Pelosi living another 100 years? I mean, come on, let's be honest. That would be the worst thing for America.
She's not in office, especially, but yeah, I mean, we got to switch it up, and it's up to us as a country. Why not? We have to do it at some point, and this is exactly what we need. It really enthuses me. Some of his speeches bring tears to my eyes when he talks about just something as simple as cutting 75% of all the office. Just go in and just slash everybody by 75%, and that sounds radical, but that brings us back to like second term Obama. That's not, it's not like the thing, it's not like we didn't have big government under Obama. It's not like he's trying to, cut us back to 1913 or something. It'd be interesting to see how many people were in the federal government in 1913 as a percentage. But we have millions of people working for government now, and we could definitely cut 75%, and most Americans would not only not notice anything bad, they'd notice something good.
You're speaking my language, baby. Oh, I hope we can get there. I hope we can. Well, I'll be keeping an eye on Vivek for sure. Thanks for filling in the gaps for me. Like, I learned a lot just from you. Just awesome. Getting some more context. If you don't take the time to dig in on these things, it's like you never really, really get there, especially on candidates like him. So
yeah, everybody should take the time, because the thing is, like I mentioned, they know everything about who votes, and the sad thing is most people don't vote, and they especially don't vote in primaries. So you have this in New Hampshire, it's this small number of 79-year-olds on average who vote in the primaries. They get to decide, and we know exactly who they are. There's 30,000 of them that are like the super likelies, and those people they count like 8 times more than a normal citizen. And that's a shame, because every citizen who is, 17 and a half years old or above, who's going to be 18 by the election, they should all be active in this. If there's the old saying, if you if you don't pay attention to politics, it doesn't matter. Politics is still going to pay attention to you. This stuff affects everybody's life, and we all owe it to ourselves, not just to our country or to our neighbors, but we owe it to ourselves to just do our small part. Look into the candidates, give them a couple bucks, be a volunteer, spread the word, and, make a bet on somebody.
Right.
And,
in other words, wake up, Americans. Stop being such complacent sheep and just doing what the media tells you to do.
It. Talk to all the people from Russia and Cuba and places like that. Don't get to a point where you regret it.
Because if you don't get it together soon, smart people like me and Bruce are going to get the hell out of here. I'm going to tell you to, solve your own problems. We're going to go live on an island somewhere.
Exactly.
All right, man. Hey, thanks for jumping on. I appreciate it. It's always great talking to you.
Thank you. Absolutely, man. You have a good one.